So here we go. Um, I've taken my film, The Long Hope, and I've taken it on the road. And as I take it on the road, that means that we got a lot of time on the road. And look, what we do is we show the film and then we do a Q&A afterwards. So the Q&A usually involves myself and my co-producer Ross John. It's usually the two of us where we don't just reiterate what the film's already said. Oftentimes we talk about things that we've learned since doing the film. Or the other thing that we do, we spend a lot of time not only trying to explain our position in the film, but we also need to revisit and evolve what our messages look like. How do we communicate this? I mean, yeah, we have the film, but how when we talk about these things, how do we explain why the legal doctrines that we try to expose in the film need to be addressed? And so that's part of what we do during our Q and A. But we drove out to Holyoke, Mass, this past week to participate in what they call Building on Our Momentum Day. Boom Day is what they call it, and they cancel classes and they have all kinds of other co-curricular activities. They have speakers come in, they have presenters come in. There was a couple of filmmakers, not just us, that came in, and the theme was really, in spite of what the Trump administration has tried to kill in terms of wokeism and anti-DEI. The theme of this year's programming was DEI. They were really promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and so the fact that we were selected to be a part of that was kind of encouraging because, as you know, there are some colleges and universities out there that have really backed off because of the threats to their funding. And look, we saw Harvard kind of turn tail, Columbia a little bit. Look, and I was been trying like hell to get into Howard University, and that's another college that worries about their funding. And so it's not always easy. So when we get into a liberal arts college like Mount Holyoke College, which is kind of a network of five other schools in the area, it was an opportunity, but it's a long drive. So it's a 6 hour drive that my co-producer, my friend, my partner Ross John and I make, and obviously we have a lot of conversation on the way. So one of the things that I asked on the way, I said, Ross, the question that I have is why. And when I say why, I'm like, and I don't even mean it rhetorically. Why would you sustain these racist doctrines, the doctrine of discovery, the trust doctrine, and the plenary powers doctrine? I mean, these are slave era doctrines that weren't even founded in their by the framers of the Constitution. It was developed shortly thereafter by Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. And there's no question that these things are overtly racist. And again, in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it says all doctrines, policies, and practices that are based on superiority of a people's, and then it goes on whether it's this superiority based on nationhood or ethnicity or culture or race, whatever it is. But what it says is any doctrine, policy, or practice that is based on promoting the superiority of one people over another, they said, is racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. So, I mean, it starts off by saying, look, it's racist. And of course, because all hierarchies based on race is essentially the whole notion of race may arguably is scientifically false. So it's racist, scientifically false, and legally invalid. So if the rest of the world can look at doctrines of the United States and not just benign doctrines, but these legal doctrines that are still used to this very day, and look at it and says, look, these things don't even have any force of law, really. What you're doing is wrong. So why sustain it? So when I asked the question, I made it clear. I understand why the United States had slavery. They were trying to exploit the labor of a people that they didn't have to have any responsibility to. I understand why they ultimately codified the doctrine of Christian discovery. They had a land title problem because we lived here first. So they create this whole notion that under the doctrine of Christian discovery, if a Christian nation of Europe comes upon a lands occupied by pagans, they can just claim the land, claim title to the land. Of course, that's ridiculous. Of course it's racist as hell. And and of course they build upon that this notion that simply because we predate their existence and we're different people and we're not included in their constitution, and I'll get into that a little bit, that they decide that, well, we are like domestic dependent nations. We're like wards to a guardian. So they create this notion that we are their wards and that they are our trustees. Of course, that's false. I mean, it's not based on competency. It's really based on their notion of race. So they're saying Native people are all wards of the federal government. And I've talked about this. I said, and this is a designation we never graduate from. That's not entirely true. Here's how we graduate from being a ward of the federal government. We deny our existence. We accept the erasure of our identity because we're welcomed in if we just be good Americans, if we settle in on white passing and deny our native identity. And of course, there's some people that'll do that, or they'll do it, sometimes. they'll white pass when it's convenient, and then they'll claim to be native when they think there's some other benefit to doing so. And that gets where we get into the whole pretendian thing. But again, this notion that the United States could just unilaterally say all Native people are wards of the federal government, and they're always going to be wards of the federal government as long as they maintain and sustain that Native identity. I mean, that's why they created this policy with the residential schools. They said, kill the Indian, save the man. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, because I'm also going to talk about language, and so we'll get to there. And of course, the plenary powers doctrine is probably the most absurd of all of them. And this just says that Congress has ultimate authority to do whatever they want to do to Native people, including canceling our government, taking our lands, taking our money, doing whatever they want to do to us. And because Congress has this, and they call it plenary powers, which means absolute authority. And it's this authority only extends to us. They don't have this over anybody else, only us. So the fact that these three things were essentially codified into law in the 1820s to 1830s, but still exist. That's where my question comes in. I understand why you did it. My question is, why do you keep doing it? I mean, you've changed certain things, and I'm not saying you solved your racism. Your legacy of racism in this country is so deeply embedded and so systemic that you can try to legislate all you want, but you're not going to change the mindset of people who still can look at other people as less than that. So you can't legislate racism away. You can try to do certain things that offer a little bit of relief to it. And of course, you do affirmative action, and then you decide, oh no, we're going to cancel affirmative action. We're not going to talk about any kind of critical race theory. We're going to take it into all these policies that no longer will acknowledge the ills of the United States. And of course, that doesn't solve anything, and erasing it on paper doesn't erase it in real life. So my question, again, why? Why continue it? And I ask the question because it doesn't work. I mean, look, this rich family from Texas, and I did a post. It's on Facebook, and I put it up on a Substack. I said, this rich family from Texas tries to adopt a Native child, and they're told they can't. They said, well, there's a federal law, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that prohibits you from doing that, especially if the nation of that child doesn't agree. So this family, the Brackeens, with oil money backing and all kinds of stuff, they say, but why? I mean, I can adopt a black child or an Asian child in the United States. I can adopt a Hispanic child, a Mexican child, a South American. I can adopt anybody else. Why can't I adopt a Native child? I mean, and what they said is that seems like an overreach of the federal government to say that these children can't be adopted by white people, especially since this is essentially a directive from the federal government telling state CPS you have to prioritize the placement of a Native child in a Native home. Well, you don't do it to anybody else that way. I mean, there may be some policies, but there's no specific federal directive saying it. And the other question that the Brackeens asked, well, isn't this a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution? Isn't it discriminatory? And what they argue is, isn't it both discriminatory to us as white people, saying that we can't adopt a Native child just because we're white? And isn't it discriminatory to that child because you're going to deprive this poor, destitute member of the unfortunate race, and that's what the way the Supreme Court justices have called us. So a member of this unfortunate race to have the pleasure of living and being adopted by an affluent family who can change that child's lifestyle. So you're harming that child by essentially depriving them of our affluence. So that was the question. So what does the Supreme Court answer? How does the Supreme Court answer it? And there is an answer, but they don't answer it. They just said Congress passed the law, and Congress can pass whatever law they want regarding Native people. So we're not even going to answer your question about federal government overreach. We're not going to answer your question about discrimination. We're not going to answer why it is that a white family can't adopt a Native child when, by most accounts, the federal government just views Native people as just another race of Americans. We're not going to answer that question. In fact, we're not even going to entertain the question. We're going to tell you right now, you're dead in the water. Congress passed the law. Congress can pass. So how does that hold up? I mean, the idea that you're going to say that Congress can pass a law that can't even be questioned about its constitutionality? I mean, I got a bunch of those questions. When you declare that we're U.S. citizens, when you just declare we're U.S. citizens, I'm thinking, do you have the legal right to do that? Is that constitutional? But you know the answer to that is? Doesn't matter if it's constitutional. Congress has the power to do whatever the hell they want to do to Native people. So my question is, understanding why you did it coming out of the 1800s, understanding that you did it to destroy us, to oftentimes to kill us, to assimilate us, and to, what you did to our children with residential schools, all of that stuff is part of your so-called trust responsibility and your plenary powers authority. I understand why you did it, but today, as you guys ramp up towards your 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal and all that crap, as you approach that, how do you still have these legal doctrines on the books? Again, UN says, oh no, they're racist. They're scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, socially unjust. And yet you keep doing it. And you know what? Some of the guys on the court, not the ones you think would raise it, are saying, yeah, we're not sure that plenary powers is constitutional. And we have some issues with this whole trust doctrine thing because we know it's not really a trust. In fact, Sam Alito made it very clear. No, it's not really a trust. It doesn't have the same fiduciary responsibilities to the wards that are being cast into this trust. In fact, they go so far through a series of cases. Sam Alito did it in a specific case involving the Jicarilla Apache and said, we fashioned this trust responsibility because it was to benefit us, not to benefit Native people. I mean, we consider the welfare of Native people as we're administering this trust, managing this trust responsibility. But the national interest of the United States is first and foremost. Well, how the hell do you have a trust where the primary beneficiary and the trustee and the creator of the trust are all the same people? I mean, that defies the whole notion of a trust responsibility. And they know it. In fact, they asked the question during that whole Brackeen case. They said, so this idea of both plenary powers and trust responsibility, that made residential schools, boarding schools, and the atrocities that we know were committed in them, that made that all perfectly legal? They asked the Solicitor General, and the Solicitor General said, well, yeah. It was a demonstration. It was a use of both their trust doctrine and their plenary powers doctrine. So they know, and these are modern conversations. These are modern hearings. These aren't 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So there's my question. And I know, look, when I ask the question to Native people, I get all kinds of it. Well, it's because they just want to destroy us. And okay, I understand what our philosophical view or the rhetorical view of this. But my question is, and the only rhetorical part of this question is, I'm not asking you, the listener, to answer it. I'm asking you, the listener, to ask the same question. Why? Why would you allow these racist legal doctrines to be sustained? Because here's the thing. What was the right answer to the Brackeen family? Because there was one. The answer is, I mean, the reason beyond the Indian Child Welfare Act, the reason white people shouldn't be allowed to adopt Native people, Native children, is because Native children are different. I don't mean they're different than any other children, but politically, we are not just a race of Americans. In fact, we could argue, many of us do, that we're not Americans, we're not U.S. citizens at all. What makes Native people distinct is our history, our culture, our the political nature of who we are, the fact that we predate the United States. All of these things make us politically distinct from any other person who's either desires to be an American that comes from another country, the whole nation of immigrants thing. We're not immigrants. And we aren't inherently U.S. citizens. In fact, we aren't U.S. citizens by your Constitution. We aren't subjugated or conquered by you according to your Articles of Confederation or your Constitution. You passed a law. You had to create a statutory framework. You had to legislate a law to declare that we were U.S. citizens, because it's not in the Constitution. We are not U.S. citizens by Constitution or constitutional amendment. You just passed a law that says, well, we declare you citizens. Well, don't we have a choice in the matter? I mean, you can't just declare we're citizens. I mean, honestly, that was actually in 1924 they passed that law. So it's over 100 years old. That's actually considered a war crime. Yeah, I mean, in fact, before the word genocide was developed, there were countries and there were political philosophers who basically said this notion of denationalizing a people, stripping away somebody's national identity, their national, everything that makes them who they are, stripping that away and replacing it, that's a war crime. And they called it that. They called it denationalization. So when the United States passes the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, it's already, that very act is already considered by many people in the world a war crime because it's stripping away our identity. So the question that I ask is, why not answer the question? The answer, the proper answer to the Brackeen's question, why they can't adopt a Native child, is because Native people are not, Native children and Native people are politically distinct from everybody else. And that's backed up by the framers of your Constitution. Look, and I've said this before, the only people who are specifically singled out and mentioned in some of your foundational documents are us. Your Declaration of Independence. It doesn't say anything about white men or black men or brown men. It doesn't say anything about Spanish or English or any. It doesn't mention anybody by specifically mentioning, except for us. And of course, you call us merciless Indian savages. I mean, you talk about the king and all the things the king did, but you don't talk about anybody's nationality or distinct culture. Only us. And you call us merciless Indian savages. So in your Declaration of Independence, you've already right there established that we are not a part of you. In fact, you complained that the king was using us, using Native people, to commit atrocities to your colonies, which isn't even true. Any of the conflicts that existed between Native people and colonists was usually because the colonists were encroaching on our lands. They were trespassing. They were trying to steal more Native land. And in fact, that's one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence, is that the king was not accommodating more immigration into the United States, which would essentially trigger the need to take more Native lands. That was one of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the King of England basically said, no, you're not going into those areas. That's where Native people live. We're not going to cause a problem. And that did nothing but manage to piss off the colonists. So we were distinct even in your Declaration. Now, in your Articles of Confederation and your regional draft of the Constitution, we're mentioned. Nobody else. They don't even make a mention to enslave people. They don't talk about people of African descent. The only reference they make in their apportionment clause are free persons, including those who are indentured for a period of time, and all others, meaning they meant enslaved, but they didn't say it. They didn't say, and they weren't referring to who was enslaved. They said all free persons would be counted for apportionment of both taxation and representation. Um, all free persons and those indentured for a period of time, and 3/5 of all others. And then but it also singles out excluding us. They refer to us as Indians not taxed. So we're excluded, and that's an expression that was framed during in the before the Constitution. In the Articles of Confederation, we were being referred to as Indians not taxed, as a group of people that were not a part of the Articles of Confederation and ultimately not a part of the U.S. Constitution. And in 1868, when they passed the 14th Amendment to essentially grant citizenship, I guess, or make the formerly enslaved and those of African descent who were born in the United States, make them citizens. And that's what they did. It made them citizens. It said all persons born in the United States and subject to U.S. jurisdiction are citizens. Now, that subject to U.S. jurisdiction is a reference to us because we weren't. And how do I know we weren't? And how do I know that reference was specific to us? Because the next section of the 14th Amendment, which addresses doing away with that 3/5 compromise for the formerly enslaved, once again says excluding Indians not taxed because we weren't a part of it. So the answer to the Brackeens is the framers of the Constitution never included Native people. So even though through statute you declared we were citizens 100 years ago, that doesn't do away with our distinction. Even if some people have accepted it, we could argue what that really means. But the answer to the question why white folks shouldn't be allowed to adopt Native children is because Native children are not the same. They don't have the same political identity as all those who have accepted U.S. citizenship. Now, if we reject our so-called tribal affiliation, I mean, if we cast that aside, if we allow that notion of kill the Indian, save the man, to say, yeah, I'm not Native. No, not me. I'm a white guy. If that's what we do, then yeah, you can adopt those kids or the parents who have somehow managed to renounce their affiliation with Native peoples, I guess. But that's not what's happening here. So that's why I come back to the question. Why don't you just answer the question? Why don't you tell the truth? Because you're framers of the Constitution, and you can argue whether all the things they did wrong, but what they got right was not including us. They got it right because we didn't want to be included. We saw what you were doing. We didn't want to be a part of that mess. We saw what you're doing to black folks. We saw what you're doing to the impoverished white folks. We saw that all the things you ran away from in Europe, you're doing it all over again right here. We didn't want to be a part of that, and we weren't. So when you create this through authoritarian rule, these legal doctrines that really defy what the entire world is now acknowledging as legal, the question is, why don't you stop? Why don't you just stop lying about who we are? So this was the conversation that my buddy Ross and I had on our 6-hour drive back from Holyoke, Massachusetts. This was part of our conversation. I want to shift gears a little bit because I want to get into another part of our conversation. The other part of our conversation, because we get asked all the time when we do the Q&As, we get asked about language and about sustaining our language and that kind of stuff. Do we have language programs? And of course we do. But one of the things that differs in our language than most of the European languages is that our language isn't noun-based. It's based not just on verbs, but adverbs and adjectives. It's a descriptive. Every one of our words is not necessarily giving a label. And I'll give you an example. And I've said this before. I've mentioned this all the time. we don't have a word for rain as a thing. Rain, rain falling from the sky. No, we have a word that describes it, and it describes our relationship. So what we say is we say yoga nuru, and that nuru part means precious, and the beginning of it means that we know that rain, that water coming from the sky, we know that it's precious. So the translation of the word that we use for rain is yoga nuru, is we know it's precious, or we say it's obvious that rain is something special. It's precious. I mean, we get into a whole lot of water is life and everything else, but even to use that simple expression, and I've got a sticker in my window in my car, water is life, and it is, but if you just say it as a matter of a two-word expression and not explain it, if you don't understand why we refer to rain and the waters that saturate our ground as something special, then you just give it a label. And then you can give it a label that you can speak ill of it. You can, rain. God damn it, it's going to rain again today. Or that rain is flooding us. The rain is ruining this. It's, you can speak ill of the rain because it might interrupt or interfere with your pursuit of happiness. But if you speak it in our language, you never for a moment forget that regardless of any inconvenience it may cause, that it's special. So that's one example. But the example that Ross and I talked about on our trip back was how we express, for lack of a better word, love. So when I say, and my grandkids and I, we say this all the time. We say yoga nuru. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We say gonorunkwa. That's our word for how you express your feelings towards somebody. That's how you say I love you. Gonorunkwa. So what does the word really mean? Well, where the word comes from is not about some heated, passionate emotion. It's really based on the responsibility that you take on for somebody that you care for. So gonorunkwa is derived from what the husks do to an ear of corn. So that's the root of the word, describes the functionality and what the husks do. They protect. They protect, they nurture, they allow those kernels of corn, that precious thing, to become what it can best become. And and the thing about corn doesn't exist in nature without human intervention, without us. We develop corn as a crop, because if a corn stalk is just isn't harvested and it falls in the field, a couple of kernels might make its way through, especially if a raccoon comes around and tears open the ear of corn and eats some of it, or a deer does. Some of those kernels might regerminate and plant another stalk, but it's unsustainable. You can't just let a cornfield go and expect corn to come up every year. I mean, there are obviously some things that do that. Berries come up every year. You don't have to necessarily plant a new berry bush. You don't have to cultivate it. Some of these things exist in nature. Corn isn't. But the thing about that same husk that doesn't allow corn to reproduce all by itself, essentially, is that it offers a protection. When George Washington sent General Sullivan and Clinton into Seneca territory and Cayuga territory and Haudenosaunee territory to destroy us, he wanted our cornfields destroyed. He said, lay waste to them, burn them, torch everything you see, because I want these people to know the terror of their chastisement. That's what George Washington said to Sullivan and Clinton in the treatment of Haudenosaunee people. They said, slash and burn. I want you to destroy their villages. I want you to destroy their corn stores. And I want you to destroy. And look, we had harvested, dried corn that they destroyed. But the stuff in the field, those husks even protected the corn. We still had food because they thought they burned our crops down, but that corn was still salvageable. It was still edible. I mean, part of part of Seneca culture is deeply connected to roast corn soup because of those very atrocities, and that's why George Washington earned the title Rundatagayas, which some people say means town destroyer. It's a little bit more violent than that. It refers to somebody who is so determined to destroy a people that they're willing to tear at our flesh. That's what Run the Gaius means, and that's why we call every president since George Washington that title. That's our word for the president of the United States. But let me get back to love, because I want to talk about the distinction between our word for love, which is about nurturing, which is about caring for, and assisting those that we love to be the best that they can be. Now, juxtapose that with your word of love. I mean, you've got all of this hate language associated. You got, there's a thin line between love and hate. You've taken love and you've turned it into something that can turn in a heartbeat from anger and passion. And passion isn't always a good thing. Passion, you can be passionately hateful and you can be passionately loving. But so your language, and when you think about how it's used, your language has a tendency to promote a behavior that is not responsible, that does not promote caring and that kind of stuff. And I'll give you another example. I get told, and of course I always refute this notion, that the policy of boarding schools, which was really geared towards assimilating Native people, they had a slogan, and that slogan was "Kill the Indian, save the man." And they would sometimes detail a little bit. They say, "Well, kill the Indian within and save the man." They would do that. They would play with these words. But at its core, it still said kill. So you had for whatever reason, you lacked the ability, even with your use of metaphor or analogy or whatever you want to call it, you could not communicate effectively the aggression with which you were going to stamp out Native identity. Because, I mean, you could have just said that. You could have just said, well, let's eliminate Native identity. Let's convert them to white folks. And you said that, but the policy was kill the Indian, save the man. Now, what we get told is that, well, they didn't literally mean kill the Indian. Well, then why are there graveyards in every one of these schools? I mean, you may not have meant to give the orders for these schools to kill us, but since you had the word in there, it wasn't beyond the pale. It wasn't beyond this notion that, in order to wipe out Native identity, some children may die. And because you use such a violent term, kill the Indian to save the man, if there was a child that was, that seemed untamable, and they referred to that, all of those Native people, they're untamed and untamable. Well, if you had a child that you couldn't tame, if you couldn't assimilate easily, you abused that child. You tortured that child. You humiliated that child. You did everything you could to beat the Native out of them. And if they died, well, they just weren't going to, they weren't going to be saved. We tried to save them. That's literally what you said. We tried to save them. We tried to civilize these merciless savages. But some couldn't be. And some died in our effort to convert them. So you may not have meant in the developing of this slogan, this strategy of kill the Indian, save the man, to say, well, let's just kill, we're going to kill enough of every one of those children that if it actually takes their life, so be it. But that's what you did. And every one of these residential schools, US and Canada, they had graveyards. You may not have literally meant kill the Indian, but because it was your policy in the US and the Canadian side, you did. You killed children. You created environments where a healthy child could not grow up unless they would fully comply to your assimilation efforts. And even they got abused. I mean, look, you've already characterized Native children as a subclass of human existence that allows you to steal them from our families, steal them from our homes. I mean, you did that. So I guess part of what I wanted to talk about was our language is different. Our language is, and I'm not saying we don't have words for some of the violent things that that we've seen around us. Well, yeah, we do, but we don't connect them to daily life in that way. We wouldn't suggest the way to raise a child is to kill a portion of them, or a piece of them to make them form. Look, another word. There are other words that I find problematic. The word sovereignty, and Native people use the word sovereignty all the time, and when we use it, we mean that we have the right to decide for ourselves. That's what we mean when we say it. The problem with the word sovereignty and its definition is that it basically has a church connotation to it. It has this notion that God chose certain ones to have power over others. But at its core, even if you can separate it from this church bestowing power, it still is about power. So the word sovereignty is usually associated with the power over people or where the power lies. So the sovereign, which traditionally would have, from a European standpoint, would have been the monarch, they're the ones with the power over people, over land, over activity, they had that power. Now, the United States, when they decided they were going to do something different than what Europe did, they still created hierarchy where the power was going to be delegated to those on top. But they implied that the true sovereignty of this new country was going to be vested in the people en masse, in the people. And of course, who wields that sovereignty are the individuals who represent those people. So it still created the hierarchy. They didn't treat sovereignty as a birthright. They didn't look at sovereignty as something that individuals possessed. They only looked at sovereignty as a collective authority that could be represented by representatives of that people. So when I see our people use the word sovereignty, it kind of bugs me because I'm not fighting for native sovereignty with that definition. What I'm fighting for is to reclaim our free and independent existence. That's different than sovereignty. So when I see words like nation or citizen, and I've talked about this in previous shows, look, the definition of a citizen is a native or naturalized person, and when I say native, they mean born in a place, not native people like us, but a native or naturalized person who has an allegiance to a government over a territory. And in exchange for that allegiance, that government, that nation's government, provides certain protections or rights or privileges. That's what a citizen is. So what if I don't support the institutionalized governing systems, native or non-native? I mean, the crazy part is when the United States made those of African descent who were born here, on Turtle Island, when it made them citizens, there was no allegiance test. When they, through a joint resolution of Congress, made Hawaiian people who still supported their government, their Hawaiian kingdom, the queen and the monarchy that they had fashioned to suit themselves, When you force citizenship on them through a joint resolution of Congress, there was no allegiance test. You didn't say, all right, we're going to make you a citizen, but only if you pledge your allegiance to us. Because the vast majority, look, there were a whole lot of black folks who to this day will not pledge allegiance to the United States. I mean, they want freedom, and they may, embrace this notion of citizenship. But the idea of pledging allegiance to the government as it existed, we just saw what the Supreme Court did to the Voting Rights Act, and the fact that this government isn't supportive of black people. I mean, even with making black people citizens, citizenship isn't freedom. So from a Native standpoint, I have no allegiance. In fact, most Native people do have a Native government that they can support or not support. And first and foremost, and you can't vote in our elections. No, you white folks, you can't vote in our elections, but you want us to vote in yours. Well, kind of you do. So this notion of citizenship, in the absence of any dedicated pledge of allegiance, is problematic. In fact, it got brought up during the birthright citizenship debate. So, again, the words matter, and your language is oftentimes filled with not only double meaning, but there's also this notion that applies to many expressions in the English language, which is a euphemism. So you might say an expression that literally might mean something, but you've already given it a different meaning. Look, the Justice Department just indicted James Comey for taking a picture of seashells that spelled out 8647. Now, 86 to 86 something means to get rid of something. So the fact that he lightheartedly took a picture and he said, "Oh, look at this shell formation." I mean, he was implying that nature itself, with this formation of shells, was saying 86 the president. Now they're going to say, well, the mob, when they say 86, they mean kill him. So they're going to try to prosecute James Comey for an expression that does not specifically mean kill. It just means get rid of, throw them out. And when you 86 something, you throw it out. But see, you're trying to say that it's a euphemism for something else. This is where you're going to apply something that isn't really a normal euphemism. But that's what you've done with your language. You create these double meanings. In fact, you'll have these. You also have this word called implicit or explicit. You would say, well, but it implies this. Yeah, but it doesn't really say that. We got into this debate over the Seneca's gaming compact. A 3-judge panel, the two white guys on the 3-judge says, well, it's implied that the Senecas would pay for the last 7 years of their compact. Well, what are you talking about? Under contract law, there's no such thing as implied stipulations in a contract. In fact, the Four Corners doctrine of contract law says if it ain't in there, it ain't in there. If it's not explicit, if it is not detailed, and if it doesn't specifically say that the Senecas were going to give money for the last 7 years of their 21-year compact with New York State, then they don't give money for the last 7 years of that 21-year compact. But two white guys said, well, it was kind of implied. There's no such thing as implication. There's no such thing as an implied clause of a contract. It has to be. But see, this is the game that gets played. I mean, and obviously it got played with all kinds of, wordsmithing of treaties and everything else. But, we know that most of those things were written with the full intent of never fulfilling the obligations. So, I mean, and again, you want to talk about something that wordsmithing? The trust relationship. The Supreme Court acknowledges that what they are claiming the United States has in terms of a trust responsibility is not the same as trust in common law. They flat out say, no, it doesn't have the same fiduciary responsibilities. We just call it that. We call it that so we can take control of their stuff. And they literally have said that. Sam Alito literally spells it out in that Hickory Apache case. He said, well, no. And he cites case law after case law ruling, all the legal dicta from at least a half dozen cases where they say, well, no, we just take control of their stuff. And we call it, but we view them as so inferior to us that we can say, we're going to take control of their stuff first and foremost for out of our best interest, but we're going to consider their welfare as we're doing it too. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, which gets back to my original question in the beginning of the show. Well, why would you continue to sustain this stuff? Because look, the English language is complicated because it is so noun based that there's always a need, and look, and this is where poetry and song lyrics and all this stuff, there's always a need to use metaphor or analogy to clearly express what you mean. And that's why the word love gets all twisted around the way it does. Because you don't have a word that adequately describes what your responsibility is in a relationship. So then you create all of these analogies, all these metaphors, poetry and song. You do all these things so you can try to describe it. And of course, in the process, you also describe love gone wrong and how hostile, how angry, and how violent it can be. I mean, the fact that there has to be a debate on whether rape was consensual or not, and we refer to that as lovemaking? Really? I mean, come on, folks. So I say this stuff because I don't think people adequately understand the words that they even say. And that's why so much is subject to interpretation. I mean, you have a debate on what the Second Amendment of your Constitution even means. I mean, I think it's pretty clear. But people want to say, oh, no, it means that everybody has the right to have a gun. Not really what it says there. So I offer this because if somebody wanted to understand how we ideologically view certain concepts, and that's the beauty of doing a show like this on a radio station in New York City or in Washington, D.C., I get to offer a perspective that you're not going to hear anywhere else. Because it doesn't really exist there. The fact that our languages are different than yours, not just because the words are different, but the way we speak, what the words mean. We have to always maintain the distinct etymology of a word, and you don't. Most people who speak English, most Americans, they have no idea where the words come from. They don't know why does a chair mean a chair? How'd that come to be? They don't understand. And they don't care as long as the label fits. I mean, so then you get into this whole idea, well, there are some words that could have broader meanings. Gender, for instance. I mean, gender conformity? Because all of a sudden you've got a narrow interpretation of what certain things mean. So all I'm suggesting is that we have a different perspective on what our language means and the words that we use. So, oftentimes people are sometimes indifferent when we try to translate something, because there isn't a word for translation for a native word. I mean, Gonorunqua doesn't necessarily mean I love you. It refers to our commitment to a relationship. And that relationship could be to a child, it could be to a partner, it could be to place. So I think I wanted to express that because I got asked some of the great students out there in Mount Holyoke College were asking, I thought, questions that kind of got in my head. And that's why Ross and I could have a 6-hour conversation coming back from Hadley, or I should say, Hadley or Holyoke, Massachusetts. I want to thank the folks out there in Mount Holyoke College for having us. I want to thank Anna Shealy for setting it up and getting us out there. It was a privilege to address your student body. And again, Ross and I are in a constant evolutionary track on how we talk about this stuff. And so today, I talked about things I've talked about before, but I'm hoping that because I use a different way of expressing it, asking that question. And that's what I want. Again, my question as to why you would sustain racist dogma isn't a rhetorical question. The only thing rhetorical about it is I want you to ask that question. I want you folks listening to this podcast, listening to this radio show, to ask that question because it makes no sense in 2026 to have these racist legal doctrines still not just existing in the books, but being used every day in lawmaking, in adjudication, in all of these legal opinions that are written. So that's my question. Look, I want to thank you for listening to this program. I want to thank you those who donated to WBI. It keeps us on the air. But I want to thank you for listening to this program, and I hope you got something out of it. That's always my biggest hope.